You may have noticed in yesterday's entry that I had a little white spot on my ear throughout the entire presentation. There's a rough spot there I've had for many years. I'm trying some different ointments on it, and that will teach me to always look in the mirror before I get on the camera. Even then, very often I miss something, like I didn't button my sleeve or, some stupid thing. Obviously, this is a crew of one. Anyway, yesterday I talked about Elizabeth Barrett Browning's plagiarism of Mathew Franklin Whittier. There's a paper that I've written on that subject. I am going to revise it a little bit to add something about yesterday's topic, but that can be accessed on my homepage, www.ial.goldthread.com, in the Articles tab. You can find that on the navigation bar on the left. But this discussion would not be complete without talking about Mathew's own review of this book, which in this case, Elizabeth Barrett, the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning, published it twice, once in England, where she simply called it Poems, and then the following year, in 1845, she published it as a drama of Exile and Other Poems. So I have 2 or 3 antiquarian reviews of that, but I also have Mathew's own review of it if he was writing as the star in the New York Tribune. So we're going to look at that. But before I do, I want to establish definitely that Margaret Fuller was not the author of all of those reviews and essays that appeared in the New York Tribune from the fall of 1844 to mid-1846. There's other clues that strongly suggest that she was not the author of those particular pieces, and by inference of the entire series. I'll give you my conclusion at the start, and that is that she was the literary editor, and she was an egotist and had no moral compunction about messing with or getting into or revising Mathew's copy such that it looked like it was him. In other words, she didn't just make a couple grammatical changes or take out a paragraph or say, please rewrite this. She would go in and rewrite whole paragraphs. In this particular case, I think that she rewrote half the article, specifically the first half. So we'll get into that in a minute. But first of all, I want to show you, and I would say it's proof, that Margaret Fuller did not write all of these reviews and essays. This is the February 22nd, 1845 edition. I think you can see the date. And here, the weekly has more than one, typically. But here we have a couple, and the first one is Review, The Child's Friend. It's a children's book designed for families and Sunday schools, edited by Eliza L. Follen, Boston, Leonard C. Bowles. So this is a review of a children's book. Now this is relevant, so just keep it in mind. And we don't need to read all of this, but down towards the bottom of the first column, we have an autobiographical reference. Now this is what I looked for I think there's 238 of these pieces, star-signed pieces in the Tribune during this period. And what I looked for was not signs of transcendentalism, because Margaret Fuller was supposed to be a transcendentalist, so you can't discern that way. I mean, not in the sense of proving anything. I can discern it, but I can't prove to anybody else with that. So I had to look for autobiographical references that precluded Margaret Fuller, and this is one of them. The author says, "Oh, that winter, freezing, snow-laden winter, which slowly ushered in our 8th birthday." Well, there we have it. Then it talks about being in a lonely farmhouse, the day's work done, and so on. Well, Margaret Fuller was not born in the winter. She also, very likely, if she visited her grandmother in the country over the Christmas holiday, she didn't do a day's work. I doubt that this woman did a day's work in her whole life. As a matter of fact, her editor, in her memoirs that was written after her tragic death, said that essentially that she was lazy, that she had a very low output, 1/10 of his, and that he could barely get her to write on anything unless she was especially motivated, especially interested in it. So right there, you know that Margaret Fuller did not write 238 essays, right? Which were sometimes on a daily basis or several times per week. It's oxymoronic right at that point. But Margaret Fuller's birthday was, I have to look it up, I think it's in May or something. I'll put it on the screen. She was not born in the winter. Neither was Mathew Franklin Whittier. His birthday was July 18, but Horace Greeley was born in the winter, February something. Now, I know of no indication that Margaret Fuller would deliberately lie about her birthday. And I'm not talking about making herself younger than she is. I mean giving herself a completely different season. So she's out. She didn't write this. Then you have Horace Greeley. He's the editor of the paper. He's hugely busy. He doesn't have time to read children's books and write reviews on children's books. But Mathew Franklin Whittier was doing undercover abolitionist work connected with the Underground Railroad at this time. And he would periodically throw in red herrings to make it appear as though the work belonged to somebody else. I've already explained this and given an example with the travelogue signed ABD in the Boston Weekly Museum, where he pretends to have gone to school on Stevens Plains, which is that way from here, about 5 minutes. And there's other examples. Rare examples, but every once in a while, like for example with Ocean Dodge and quails in the Boston Weekly Museum, Mathew actually reinforced the rumor that Quails, the travelogue, was written by Ocean Dodge by taking on Ocean Dodge's own birthday, saying that this was his birthday. And it wasn't his birthday. Mathew's birthday was in July, but he's done this birthday trick before. And then he leaves lots of cute clues, rather, that it really was him, see, in the Ocean Dodge piece, Quails piece. So he's done it again here, in my opinion. But anyway, we will move on. I just wanted to show that at the very least, it absolutely proves that Margaret Fuller wasn't writing all of these pieces that are signed with a star, as she claimed. She wrote some later on, I think. This one, if I'm not mistaken, she rewrote, but she rewrote the first half. Now here it is, and I'll take it out of the wrapping. This, bunched together with a few others, is the January 18, 1845 edition of the Weekly. And if you look at the back, you will see that it's torn. Well, this, in fact, is the page, actually on the back, in which this review appears. Now, this is a little fragile. I don't want it to come apart on me here if I can help it. But on this back page, and the portion that's torn at the bottom is primarily the poems, the excerpts of the poems, lengthy excerpts. So what I've done is to print it out and leave it with my antiquarian copy so that we have the whole text. Now, reading from my printed copy is a little bit dangerous because if I make a typo, I might read right on through that typo. I've done that several times and have had to go back and re-record it underneath the graphic, which is a lot of extra work. So I found a couple typos in this actually while I was looking it over. But what I think happened here is that Mathew wrote a pretty scathing, pretty negative review, like the one that we looked at yesterday. And here's the thing about Mathew. He's a Christian. He believes, at least intellectually, he believes in turning the other cheek. Temperamentally, he wants revenge. Okay, so he really has to fight himself in order to be a Christian. So he struggles back and forth between the kind of satire that we saw yesterday and being a Christian and turning the other cheek, which we see, or I have seen, with Edgar Allan Poe. Here, I think this was pretty fresh because it was only 3 years earlier in 1842 that Mathew had sent these poems to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And we're talking Lady Geraldine's Courtship, Wine of Cyprus, The Lost Bower, and A Child Asleep. And possibly The Cry of the Children was Abby's. And the Child Asleep, which was originally called The Dream by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, where she first published it, those two would have been sent in 1838. So The Cry of the Children, I think, was originally Abby's work. This starts out with a glowing assessment of Elizabeth Barrett. Elizabeth Barrett, apparently she signed as. And then, about halfway through, it suddenly turns completely on its heels and talks about all of her flaws, which it's like if the flaws were real, the first part, the glowing appreciation of her, wouldn't fit. It wouldn't make sense because the poet that's described in the second half couldn't be the exemplary poet in the first half. So unless I missed my mark, Margaret Fuller, who was always championing the women no matter what, rewrote this review, the first half. She got bored about the second half and didn't see anything all that bad about it and went ahead and just redid the first half. I could be wrong about this, but I'm going to read it, or a significant portion of it. I'm not going to read the excerpts. What happiness for the critic when, as in the present instance, his task is mainly how to express a cordial admiration, to indicate an intelligence of beauties rather than regret for defects. Now that could have been Mathew writing in his code, which is to say, it implies something that it doesn't actually say. And it may be ironic when he says, what happiness for the critic. He may have originally said, what a dilemma for the critic. And Margaret Fuller goes in and changes it to what happiness for the critic. So you don't know what was really there. But his task is mainly how to express a cordial admiration. Well, that's not very strong. To indicate an intelligence of beauties rather than regret for defects. Well, saying that he has a job on his hands is not praise, okay? So I think originally it said, what a task for the critic, or what a dilemma for the critic, you know? And then Margaret Fuller, feeling that that wasn't strong enough, that neutral statement made it positive. That's my guess. Second paragraph, we have read these volumes with feelings of delight far warmer than the writer in her sincerely modest preface would seem to expect from any reader, and cannot hesitate to rank her in vigor and nobleness of conception, depth of spiritual experience, and command of classic allusion above any female writer the world has yet known. That's got to be, either I'm completely wrong that Mathew was not the star, which I know he was, or else that's Margaret Fuller, who's completely inserted her own paragraph. Because first of all, this woman, Elizabeth Barrett, did not have depth of spiritual experience. That's precisely what she didn't have. And neither did Margaret Fuller. They're both phonies, okay? They're both pretend spiritual people. So since Margaret Fuller wouldn't know spiritual depth if it bit her, and neither would Elizabeth Barrett, here we have Margaret Fuller praising Elizabeth Barrett's supposed depth of spiritual experience. It's a dead giveaway. Mathew would never have said this, and nobody in their right mind who really understood spirituality would ever have thought to praise Elizabeth Barrett on that particular point. That's like her total weakness. It would be like praising Charles Dickens on his astute understanding of metaphysics in A Christmas Carol, you know, because that was not his forte, see? And it was not Elizabeth Barrett's forte either. As for vigor and nobleness of conception, command of classical allusion, that's because she had a real scholar behind her, revising her work for her and giving her feedback. Hugh Stuart Boyd. See, that's where her great understanding of the classics comes from. Now, how much of it rubbed off on her, I don't know, but I would have to guess that she ran these poems by him as long as he was alive, and that occasionally you would see him there. Now she says, or assuming this is Margaret Fuller, in delicacy of perception, Miss Barrett may vie with any of her sex. She has what is called a true woman's heart, although we must believe that men of a fine conscience and good organization will have such a heart no less. Signal instances occur to us in the cases of Spencer, Wordsworth, and Tennyson. The woman who reads them will not find hardness or blindness as to the subtle workings of thoughts and affections. That could be Mathew back again. So it may have been that Margaret Fuller had just inserted the previous two paragraphs. I'm guessing she's modified this one. I don't think she wants to bother with writing the whole thing over. Basically, she's coming in here and revising. And then the author says, if men are often deficient on this score, women, on the other hand, are apt to pay excessive attention to the slight tokens, the little things of life. Thus, in conduct or writing, they tend to weary us by a morbid sentimentalism. From this fault, Miss Barrett is wholly free. Personal feeling is in its place, enlightened by capital R reason, ennobled by capital I imagination. The earth is no despised resting place for the feet. The heaven bends wide above, rich in starry hopes, and the air flows around exhilarating and free. I'm guessing that the first part of this paragraph was Mathew's, and the second part was Fuller's, because at the beginning, the thought that started is, if men are often deficient on this score, women, on the other hand, are apt to pay excessive attention to the slight tokens, the little things of life. Thus, in conduct or writing, they tend to weary us by a morbid sentimentalism. Well, Margaret Fuller wouldn't have written that about women poets. That was Mathew's commentary. But this second part, from this fault, Miss Barrett is wholly free, this doesn't make sense. Margaret Fuller would not say that most female writers are sentimental, morbidly sentimental. On the other hand, Mathew would not say that, the heaven bands wide above, rich in starry hopes, and the air flows around exhilarating and free. And I'll tell you why he wouldn't have said that. Anything connected with the stars, certainly with regard to a woman poet, would be reserved for Abby, for Mathew's Abby, who had died 4 years earlier, roughly. He would not have attributed any mystical understanding or appreciation of the stars to any other female poet. So this is a mixture, this paragraph. Then, let's see, there's a quote, extended, not a very long quote, from Perplexed Music, and he continues, "We are accustomed now to much verse on moral subjects, such as follows the lead of Wordsworth and seeks to arrange moral convictions as melodies on the harp. But these tones are never deep unless the experience of the poet in the realms of intellect and emotion be commensurate with his apprehension of truth. Wordsworth moves us when he writes an Ode to Duty or Dion, because he could also write Ruth and the exquisitely tender poems on Mathew, in whom nature," and he quotes, "for a favorite child had tempered so the clay that every hour the heart ran wild, yet never went astray." I have not looked that up to see if there's anything before or after it. I will do so and put it on the screen if I find anything. That was one of Mathew's methods of code, was to quote something, but then the real message he was trying to give was either before or after that quote. "The trumpet call of Luther's, quote, judgment hymn sounds from the depths of a nature capable of all human emotions, or it could not make the human ear vibrate as it does. The calm convictions expressed by Miss Barrett in the sonnets come with poetic force because she was also capable of writing The Lost Bower, The Romaunt of the Page, Loved Once, Bertha in the Lane, and A Lay of the Early Rose. These we select as the finest of the tender poems." Now, this is a conundrum here, because The Lost Bower is one of the ones she plagiarized that Mathew had apparently sent her in 1838. The other ones I really haven't looked at closely, but these are like the little personal poems. And what the author is saying is that Elizabeth Barrett is capable of writing from the heart, basically, from personal experience, which she isn't. That's precisely what she cannot do. She's an imitator. She's a phony, like Edgar Allan Poe. So he's the first one he quotes as evidence that she's capable of doing this is The Lost Bower, which was written by himself, by Mathew. So what is this? Is this written by Fuller? Is it written in irony by Mathew, or in an attempt to convey code? I would say that this was Mathew's attempt to show that Elizabeth Barrett did not write from the heart. And rather than completely rewriting it, Fuller has gone in and just tinkered with it to make it look the opposite, like he's trying to show and leading up to the idea that, in fact, she did write from the heart. Now she stops, because Mathew's original intention now picks up. So, if I'm not mistaken, so it continues in, quote, "the drama of exile and, quote, vision of poets, where she," meaning Barrett, "aims at a Miltonic flight or Dantonesque grasp, not in any spirit of rivalry or imitation, but because she is really possessed of a similar mental scope, her success is far below what we find in the poems of feeling and experience, for she has the vision of a great poet, but little in proportion of his plastic power. She is at home in the capital U universe. She sees its laws. She sympathizes with its motions. She has the imagination all compact, the healthy archetypal plant from which all forms may be divined and, so far as now existent, understood. Now keep in mind, before he disparaged her feminine mysticism. So I think what's happening here is that Mathew is not completely disillusioned with Barrett. He knows that she stole his poetry, his personal poetry, but he still wants to give her the credit for being a metaphysician, for having really a true intellectual understanding. So his take on her is that she doesn't have the personal element. She doesn't write from the heart, but intellectually she's still a mystic, And that's because he believes that she had been the real author of an essay on mind, which was published many years earlier in the 20s, 26, I think. That was also not hers. Had he understood that she had plagiarized that also, and that anything scholarly that's coming out of her is from Hugh Stuart Boyd, her mentor, and that an essay on mind was never hers to begin with, he would understand the depth of the fakery that's going on. Here, so far, he does not. In 1857, apparently, the stuff that I read yesterday, he does. So here he's trying to make excuses for her that intellectually she's a mystic, but she doesn't have the personal element. And then Margaret Fuller went in and tried to reverse that rather badly. Like Milton, she sees the angelic hosts in real presence. Like Dante, she hears the spherical concords and shares the planetary motions. But she cannot, like Milton, marshal the angels so near the earth as to impart the presence other than by sympathy. He who is near her level of mind may, through the magnetic sympathy, see the angels with her. Others will feel only the grandeur and sweetness she expresses in these forms. Still less can she, like Dante, give by a touch the key which enables ourselves to play on the same instrument. She is singularly deficient in the power of compression. There are always far more words and verses than are needed to convey the meaning, and it is a great proof of her strength that though the thought still seems strong, when arrayed in a form so Briarian, clumsy, and many-handed. I don't know what Briarian is. So we've gone from the very beginning, when she was the greatest female poet of the modern age, to saying that she's clumsy and many-handed, and that she can't inspire, that she only writes intellectually. So this now, Fuller apparently has left alone. Then we continue. We compare her with those great poets, though we have read her preface and see how sincerely she deprecates any such comparison, not merely because her theme is the same as theirs, but because, as we must again repeat, her field of vision and nobleness of conception are such that we cannot forbear trying her by the same high standard to see what she lacks. Well, Fuller, the great fan, did not write that, I don't think. Of the drama of Exile and other poems of the same character, we may say that we shall never read them again, but we are very glad to have read them once, to see how the grand mysteries look to her, to share with her the conception and outline of what would, in the hands of a more powerful artist, have come forth a great poem. Well, if I'm not mistaken, this is another one of Mathew's neutral, carefully, deliberately worded neutral statements. Look what he's actually saying. Of the drama of Exile and other poems of the same character, I mean, that's a blanket condemnation, we may say that we shall never read them again, but we are very glad to have read them once, to see how the grand mysteries look to her. So he's glad he read them once by way of evaluating her, to figure out where she's coming from, not to appreciate them. In the very same tone, writing as B, which I believe stood for Bertram, which was the main character in Lady Geraldine's courtship, Mathew wrote about Poe, shortly after Poe's death, that for many reasons he was glad he had the opportunity to hear Poe recite Al Araf and then The Raven in Boston in 1845. For many reasons he was glad to have the opportunity to hear him. Same idea, the same tone. He didn't say that he really enjoyed it and that he was a fan and that he's really glad he went because it was a wonderful experience. All right. Our favorite above anything we've read of hers is the rhyme of the Duchess May, equally admirable in thought and execution, in poetic meaning and romantic grace. That doesn't make any sense. He's praising the rhyme of the Duchess May in poetic meaning when saying that she can't convey meaning, meaning deep felt meaning. So presumably Fuller has tacked on that last line because this just didn't sound quite positive enough to her. And the writer continues, were there room here, it should be inserted as a sufficient evidence of the writer's high claims, but it is too long and does not well bear being broken. The touches throughout are fine and forcible, but they need the unison of the whole to give them their due effect. I think that's Fuller. In other words, they're not going to excerpt from the rhyme of the Duchess May because it doesn't bear being broken, but the touches throughout are fine and forcible, but she can't show any of them. Probably because she doesn't want to bother, because Mathew didn't actually quote that originally. That's what that is. See, I think and Horace Greeley makes this pretty clear in what's supposed to be a memorial piece for Fuller. He says she was lazy and temperamental and never wrote anything unless she felt like it, and it was like pulling teeth to get her to write anything, and that his output was 10 times as much as hers. That's what Horace Greeley, the editor, says, trying to be fair to her. See? So I think she was too lazy to bother excerpting the thing and made a little excuse for 2 sentences. Could be wrong. And speculation. I'm just putting this together, trying to make sense of this, because by itself, as a piece of literature, as a review, this thing doesn't make sense. It reads like 2 different people, one of whom was totally a fan and one of whom had been ripped off by her and was trying to be circumspect. The next paragraph is, most of these poems have great originality in the thought and the motive powers. Well, that makes no sense because he's just said she doesn't have originality and motive powers. It is these, we suppose, that have made the Brown Rosary so popular. It has long been handed about in manuscript, and hours spent in copying it, which would have been spared if the publication of these volumes in America had been expected so soon. It does not please us so well as many of the others. The following, for instance, is just as original, full of grace, and almost perfectly simple. And there's a poem about little Ellie. I don't think she wrote that. I don't know if Abby wrote this. It's possible she did, but I will tell you that intuitively, I feel that Fuller didn't write it. I don't think that Mathew and Abby were the only poets that Elizabeth Barrett plagiarized. So there'll be other people. This is quoted completely. Looks like the entire poem is quoted. Very long. So it may actually have been Abby's. It starts out, little Ellie sits alone mid the beeches of a meadow, by a stream side on the grass, and the trees are showering down doubles of their leaves in shadow on her shining hair and face. She has thrown her bonnet by, and her feet she has been dipping in the shallow water's flow. Now she holds them nakedly in her hands, all sleek and dripping, while she rocketh to and fro. Little Ellie sits alone, and the smile she softly useth fills the silence like a speech, while she thinks what shall be done, and the sweetest pleasure chooseth for her future within reach. I think that was Abby. I really haven't thought about it much, but there's one that I definitely know is hers that Mathew published in the Boston Weekly Museum of, I think it's 1850. It's called Lilius, which is Scottish for lily, and it talks about her as a little girl. Her mother had told her about the fairies, and she went all day out in the country, which apparently she was allowed to do on her own even when she was little, looking for the fairies. And this is very similar. This would be Abby talking about herself as a child out in nature. She was really a nature mystic. And here she is imagining her future lover and how gallant he will be. So I suspect, first off, I strongly suspect that was not Elizabeth Barrett's poem. And secondly, I suspect it was Abby's. And thirdly, I suspect that it is quoted, I think the whole thing here, I'd have to check, but certainly at great length, by Mathew, because it's in tribute to Abby, because he wants that to be published. See? Now he continues, Miss Barrett makes many most fair and distinct pictures, such as this of the Duchess May at the fatal moment when her lord's fortress was giving away. And that's not very long. It's, like one stanza, basically. And he finishes that. He says, and so on. There are passages in that poem beyond praise. Well, That could be Fuller. It could be Mathew using another ironic phrase, beyond praise. Well, that could go either way. Could be below praise or above praise, I don't know. I'm speculating on that. It's very difficult to pick out the plagiarist, especially when the plagiarist monkeys with it. See, Albert Pike did that with Abby Poyen's 14-year-old poetry as well. And it's a little easier in that case because you've got a big boorish man who's inserting his thumb into the delicate spiritual poetry of a 14-year-old girl. So it's a little easier to pick his out because Abby's talking about the stars and the heavens, and suddenly Pike comes in with something about a drunken Bacchus getting a joyride in a chariot with a goddess. See, well, the second part was clearly Albert Pike. The first part was clearly Abby. Here it's a little tougher. But now, suddenly, he quotes Lady Geraldine's courtship at length. And that's because Mathew wrote it, but more so, it's because these are all tributes to Abby. So Mathew is not so much concerned about saving his reputation or the things he wrote. He's concerned about preserving Abby's legacy and her poetry and the things he wrote in tribute to her. That's what he's primarily printing here at length, okay? He's not that worried about, I'm not going to get credit for these poems. He's worried about the fact that these were Abby's. They never got published for her. So he's going to make sure that the public sees them, even if they don't know correctly who wrote them. So here's a long excerpt from Lady Geraldine's courtship, and he begins. Let's see what he starts with, if it has to do specifically with Abby. Her foot upon the new-mown grass, bareheaded, with the flowing of the virginal white vesture gathered closely to her throat, with the golden ringlets in her neck, just quickening by her going, and appearing to breathe sun for air, and doubting if to float. I think that's right. I'd have to check. I may have made a typo. With a branch of dewy maple, which her right hand held above her, and which trembled a green shadow in betwixt her and the skies, as she turned her face in going, thus she drew me on to love her, and to study the deep meaning of the smile hid in her eyes. For her eyes alone smiled constantly, her lips had serious sweetness, and her front was calm, the dimple rarely rippled on her cheek, but her deep blue eyes smiled constantly, as if they had by fitness won the secret of a happy dream. She did not care of speak. That could be to speak. That's biographical for Abby Poyen, and I'll show you why I say that. We already know from Lilius that she was a nature mystic, that she loved to spend time out in nature from a little girl, and Mathew would go with her. That's what we see in The Wine of Cyprus and Lady Geraldine's courtship, is them out in nature. She was tutoring her, which we see in some of the other poems, but they would also go out for long walks. I know from another poem by Mathew that they were permitted even to take walks in the evening alone when she was 15, and when he was really desiring her but couldn't do anything about it. So it was like torture to him, but we know that they did take walks out under the stars at night. That he saw her as being very pure. She was 4 years younger. Now, the golden ringlets in her neck, Abby's hair was auburn. Occasionally, when Mathew would write about Abby, he would flip-flop a couple little details to hide her identity, like making her the daughter of an earl in England instead of the daughter of a marquis in America. So he probably gave her blonde hair. But the rest of this, with her as a nature mystic, really was Abby. I mean, this is not Elizabeth Barrett at the last minute, over the course of a day, dashing out some poem, imagining to be a man in love with a woman, to fill up her volumes, to make the first volume the same length as the second as demanded by her publisher. That's not what this is. That's what she said it was. That's what she wrote to Hugh Stuart Boyd. Now, recently, when I was randomly going through my database, and I landed on Punch, and I read for you the poem that Mathew wrote for Punch, and I got to the section that I had a strong past life hit on, that it made Abby giggle, that he loved to make her laugh, that she was the serious one, the Victorian, and she was the serious one, and he was the humorist, and he loved to make her laugh. Now, I may have read this in passing, but I really hadn't paid any attention to this passage. But here it is, okay, for her. And I also have remembered and mentioned in my books that my memory of Abby is that she didn't speak very often, but that when she spoke, it was like E.F. Hutton, that everybody better listen because it was going to be something meaningful. In other words, she didn't chatter frivolously, but when she said something, it was right on target, like usually some kind of very hard-hitting ironies just said in a couple words or a sentence, So it gives you an idea of her personality. So here he says, for her eyes alone smiled constantly. Her lips had serious sweetness, and her front was calm. The dimple rarely rippled on her cheek, but her deep blue eyes, and Matthew's very often given her blue eyes, smiled constantly, as if they had, by fitness, won the secret of a happy dream. She did not care to speak. Now, that's Abby. It's a description of Abby, okay? I know what people are thinking, too many conclusions on too little evidence, but I can't share all the evidence with you. This is what I've been trying to explain. I have the evidence, but sharing it with you, especially against your will, is pretty tough. I have it. So then he continues, because he quotes more of this poem. How fine are both the descriptive and critical touches in the following passage. And sometimes on the hillside, while we sat down in the gowans, I think that's English, with the forest green behind us and its shadow cast before, and the river running under and across it from the rowans, a brown partridge whirring near us till we felt the air it bore. That's all British references. Matthew would have written it for England. I mean, that wasn't all Elizabeth Barrett modifying it. Matthew said it in England. There, obedient to her praying, did I read aloud the poems made by Tuscan flutes or instruments more various of our own, read the pastoral parts of Spenser, or the subtle interflowings found in Petrarch's sonnets. Here's the book. The leaf is folded down. This is after Abby died. This is exactly what he did in The Raven when he was looking at her volume, which he had reviewed many years earlier, of Frances Quarles and her antiquarian volumes of metaphysics. Here, he's apparently retained her books. He's saying he's found the very book that he read from at her bidding while they were out studying, while she was tutoring him. The leaf is folded down. Or at times a modern volume, Wordsworth's solemn-thoughted idyll, Howitt's Ballad Due, or Tennyson's God Vocal Reverie, or from Browning, meaning Mr. Browning before he married Elizabeth, because Matthew liked Browning, or from Browning some pomegranate, which, if cut deep down the middle, shows a heart within, blood tinctured, of a veined humanity. Now, when Robert Browning read this poem, my understanding is he fell in love with her based on that poem. When he read that line, he thought that Elizabeth was praising his poetry. That was Mathew Franklin Whittier praising his poetry. Or I read there sometimes hoarsely some new poem of my making. Oh, your poets never read their own best verses to their worth. For the echo in you breaks upon the words which you are speaking, and the chariot wheels jar in the gate through which you drive them forth. So he was learning poetry from her. I don't think he learned poetry so much from his older brother, John Greenleaf Whittier. I think he learned it from Abby when she was a little girl because she was a prodigy. So before Abby taught him poetry, he could write humorous poetry, doggerels and various kinds of humorous lyrics. But she taught him to write serious poetry. He was never as good as she was. That's why in Waverley Magazine in August of 1853, when he weighs into this discussion about the authorship of The Raven and Thomas Chivers signing as the star, he says that P could write in all different styles, that she loved the Mockingbirds and could write in all different styles, and not everybody could do that. That wasn't P for Poe, that was P for Poyen. He was talking about Abby and saying that she could have the ability to write excellent poetry in many different styles. But he didn't, so he's embarrassed to read his poetry to her. After, when we were grown tired of books, the silence round us flinging a slow arm of sweet compression, felt with beatings at the breast, she would break out on a sudden in a gush of woodland singing, like a child's emotion in a god, a naiad tired of rest. I've gone through this before. Elizabeth Barrett reversed the last line. It should read, like a god's emotion in a child, a naiad tired of rest, because she was a child and she had a god's emotion. She was an advanced soul, an old soul. Okay? So, but Elizabeth Barrett said, well, she can't make it seem as though Lady Geraldine was a child, so she reversed it, like a child's emotion in a god. But Elizabeth Barrett has no idea what she's talking about. So that figure, a child's emotion in a god, that makes of Lady Geraldine a childish woman, which she obviously wasn't. See, so we have layers of people getting in, and ignorant people getting in and altering this poetry. Meanwhile, Mathew thought of Abby as a naiad or a river sprite, apparently because she swam in the nearby Merrimack River. And I have many instances, which I've shared here, of Abby as a naiad or a river sprite or a water sprite. That's what this reference is. And we know from a number of references that Abby was a child prodigy in music and that she had a wonderful singing voice. So she would sing for him out on these tutoring sessions. They were falling in love. She fell in love with him first. And then as she grew up and kind of blossomed as a young woman, which I have a number of references to, he fell in love with her. Oh, to see or hear her singing, scarce I know which is divinest, for her looks sang too. She modulates her gestures on the tune, and her mouth stirs with the song like a song. And when the notes are finest, 'tis the eyes that shoot out vocal light and seem to swell them on. That's Mathew's description of Abby singing. And it's been lost because everybody thinks that this is Elizabeth Barrett Browning just dashing something off to satisfy her publisher, to make her books of equal length. I mean, it's absurd. It's utterly absurd, you know. And yet everybody has just bought it. Then we talked. Oh, how we talked. Her voice, so cadenced in the talking, made another singing of the soul, a music without bars, while the leafy sounds of woodlands humming round where we were walking brought interposition worthy sweet as skies about the stars. Now, you know that Abby loved the stars, that whenever Mathew referenced her after her death, he would very often bring in the stars as a symbol of her. And she was brilliant. They would have in-depth discussions, and she was every bit his equal, if not his superior intellectually. And they had wonderful, wonderful discussions. I remembered one of them. I had a very strong past life hit of Abby and Mathew walking hand in hand in the evening down a street in a small town. The houses were all lit with the glow of fires. The trees were leafless, so it was like in the fall sometime, and it was not really cold. And we were in another world. We were in a century far beyond our own century when that nobody could understand what we were talking about. I think we were planning a Christmas Carol, the writing of it. We were trying to think of how could we make a dent in humanity's suffering? What could we as a couple possibly do to help humanity? That's what I think the subject was. But I just had this very strong hit. I did not know, at least consciously at this time, I did not know that in New England, the streets were tree-lined, but I distinctly saw it in that vision. And then some couple years later, however long it was, or months later, I found a photograph of a tree-lined street, and I got very excited. I thought, well, that's the one I remembered seeing. And then I found out that they're all like that, you know, that everywhere in New England they have tree-lined streets. They just didn't have them in Miami, where I grew up. They had banyan or ficus trees, you know, but they didn't have tree-lined streets like that. And they didn't have them in Atlanta and Myrtle Beach and so on, but they have them all through New England. So I wouldn't have gotten excited and thought that was the very one if I had subconsciously known that that was the case in New England. So that was a pretty accurate memory. But that's what they used to do. They would, you know, it was better than sex, you know. They would go off into these wonderful flights, intellectual, moral discussions. And there's no reason to attribute all of these things to the daughter of an earl in England. You know what I'm saying? This is, you know, and Abby really was aristocracy, but all of these things are so specific. They're too specifically autobiographical for Abby Poyen to be coincidence. And she spake such good thoughts natural, as if she always thought them, and had sympathy so ready, open free like bird on branch, just as ready to fly east as west, whichever way besought them, in the bircham wood a chirrup, or a cock-crow in the grange. Just as ready to fly east and west, that's code, because Abby studied the mysticism of east and west, and we have evidence that Abby, in her poetry, that Abby did study the metaphysics of the East, which is to say India, Persia, and so on. In her utmost lightness there is truth, and often she speaks lightly, and she has a grace in being gay, which mourners even approve, for the root of some grave earnest thought is understruck so rightly as to justify the foliage and the waving flowers above. The entire extended excerpt that Mathew has used in writing this review is specifically the portion about Abby. Okay, so his motivation here is to give that tribute. Then he says, we must copy yet one other poem to give some idea of the range of Miss Barrett's powers. Now that's ironical because a plagiarist has range because they copy from a bunch of different people and because they write some on their own and they copy some. So that range, I think, should be in quotation marks if he were really able to write correctly. But what comes next? The Cry of the Children. That's the one that I believe Abby wrote herself. So first he has quoted his description of her, his memory of her out in the country when she was tutoring him, when she was like 15. And now he's going to give her own poem. And how much of it does he give? Basically, I think it's the whole thing. I think he quotes the entire poem. And he does that because Elizabeth Barrett has, by publishing Abby's poem, has precluded him ever publishing it for her posthumously, see, which he would love to have done. So now he's going to tie this entire poem to his star signature. If anybody ever figures out that he was the star, and we've seen that it can't always be Margaret Fuller because she was not born in the winter and did not do a day's work in the winter, they will know that this was Abby's poem. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in my paper, I have pointed out one little smoking gun, at least I think it is. I'm going to read the first stanza. Do ye hear the children weeping, O my brothers, ere the sorrow comes with years? They are leaning their young heads against their mothers, and that cannot stop their tears. The young lambs are bleating in the meadows, bleating with a T. The young birds are chirping in the nest. The young fawns are playing in the shadows. The young flowers are blowing from the west. But the young children, O my brothers, they are weeping bitterly. They are weeping in the playtime of the others, in the country of the free. Now, what country of the free are we talking about? England? Is England ever known as the country of the free? I don't think so. I think Britannia rules the waves. I don't think England, if you're going to characterize England with a phrase, you don't say the country of the free. I don't think. I could be wrong. Any scholars out there may correct me in the comments. But America is the land of the free. The Star-Spangled Banner, although it didn't go by that title, had been in print and was very well known in America. The land of the free is in the original. It was well known. America was known as the land of the free by 1845. This is Abby. And originally she had written in the land of the free. And Elizabeth Barrett didn't know that phrase. She wasn't familiar with the Star-Spangled Banner. She didn't know that America was called the land of the free. So she looked at it and she said, oh, that's nice. Clueless. She says, that's nice, but I think I'll make it the country of the free. That's what I think happened. Anyway, the entire poem is replicated from top to bottom as near as I can see here. And the reason for that is that Mathew wants the entire poem printed over his star signature. If it can be said that the poetry, the tragedy here is in the facts, yet how rare is it to find a mind that can both feel and upbear such facts? That's also one of these statements. He doesn't actually say that Elizabeth Barrett wrote it. he asks a question. If it can be said that the poetry, the tragedy here is in the facts, yet how rare is it to find a mind that can both feel and upbear such facts? It's very rare. It's so rare that Elizabeth Barrett is definitely not among them, but Abby Poyen was. Now let's continue. This is going to be long. I want to go through this. We don't have too much more. I'm going to get a quick glass of water here, sip. I don't always misspeak as much as I do in these entries, by the way. I'm a little nervous. I got 2 or 3 things going on at once in my mind, and I misspeak. We have already said that, as a poet, Miss Barrett is deficient in plastic energy, and that she is diffuse. We must add many blemishes of overstrained and constrained thought and expression. Now, this is not the part that Fuller revised. She's apparently let him go at this point. The ways in which words are coined or forced from their habitual meanings does not carry its excuse with it. We find no gain that compensates the loss of elegance and simplicity. One practice which has already had its censors of using the adjective for the noun, as in the case of the cry of the human, leaning from the golden, we also find offensive, not only to the habitual tastes, but to the sympathies of the very mood awakened by the writer. Now, the conundrum that Matthew's in here is that he can't say that she's a plagiarist. And yet, he has to praise the poetry that he wrote and that Abby wrote while being critical of the poetry that Barrett wrote without saying that's what he's doing. So it's a very fine line he has to walk here. But look at how he's panned her poetry, meaning the poetry that she wrote, as compared with the opening. I mean, if I can find it real quick, do we need to go back to the opening? We have read these volumes with feelings of delight far warmer than the writer, in her sincerely modest preface, would seem to expect from any reader, and cannot hesitate to rank her in vigor and nobleness of conception, depth of spiritual experience, and command of classic allusion above any female writer the world has yet known. Well, if this was all the same reviewer, and he or she had said that this is to be ranked above any female writer the world has ever known, and then he pans her in this way, then that means that all the other female writers in the world were truly awful. It cannot be the same reviewer. But then Matthew softens a little bit because he is compassionate and he hasn't yet figured out the sheer extent of her hypocrisy. So he says, we hear that she has been long an invalid, and while the knowledge of this increases admiration for her achievements and delight at the extent of the influence, so much light flowing from the darkness of the sick room, we seem to trace injurious results too. There is often a want of pliant and glowing life. The sun does not always warm the marble. We have spoken of the great book culture of this mind, which he doesn't realize that's actually Hugh Stuart Boyd behind her. We must now say that this culture is too great in proportion to that it has received from actual life. So this is Matthew's excuse for her. He's making an excuse for her that she's an invalid. She spent most of her time indoors, and that she can be excused for not writing from real life on that basis. Now remember, in The Lost Bower, she or he has this character, this young child, tearing through the brambles. Anyway, the ore is not always assimilated to the new form. The illustrations sometimes impede the attention rather than help its course, and we are too much and too often reminded of other minds and other lives. Let me read that one again. The ore is not always assimilated to the new form. The illustrations sometimes impede the attention rather than help its course, and we are too much and too often reminded of other minds and other lives. Now, that could mean one of two things. It could mean what it's supposed to mean on the surface, and that is that she lives most of her life shut up in a room, and as he has also said about Longfellow, draws on other poems that she's read or other people's experience, and that therefore it doesn't come from the heart. But it could also mean that there's too many other poets' poems in her published works. So that's a double entendre. Great variety of meters are used, and with force and facility. That's another mark of a plagiarist, is that they're all over the map in terms of style. But all of the ones that I have determined written by Mathew are of the same style. The Lost Bower, A Child Asleep, Lady Geraldine's Courtship, Wine of Cyprus are all written in the same meter. That was the meter that Mathew was comfortable with, and that's why it's so often, Lady Geraldine's Courtship is so often compared to the style of the Raven, because he wrote both of them. And why haven't people been able to figure this out? See, it's because of the a priori assumptions. You know, you assume from the beginning that the con artist's picture of the world that they've created, of who they are and where they are, this is the classic con artist technique. Get the person on the other end of the phone to see and imagine and believe in the world that you've created and who you are. And then you can say anything and it'll get right past them. We have thus pointed out all the faults we could find in Miss Barrett, feeling that her strength and nobleness deserve this act of high respect. She has no need of leniency, of caution. And then he quotes her preface and closes with that. Well, not quite. There's 2 more paragraphs to close. Of the greatest Grecian sages, it was said that he acquired such power over the lower orders of nature through his purity and intelligence that wild beasts were abashed and reformed by his admonitions, and that once, when walking abroad with his disciples, he called down the white eagle soaring above him and drew from her willing wing a quill for his use. We have seen women use with skill and grace the practical goose quill, the sentimental crow quill, and even the lyrical, the consecrated feathers of the swan. Remember that Mathew knew Abby very well and that she was a poet. But we have never seen one to whom the white eagle would have descended. And that's odd, because he wouldn't say that, because Abby actually was such a person. So, you know, did Fuller write this? You know, did she modify it? Because that's a red flag for me. He wouldn't have said that because he knew Abby and the white eagle would have descended to her, see? So there's something wrong here. And for a while, we're inclined to think that the hour had now for the first time arrived. But upon full deliberation, we will award to Miss Barrett one from the wing of the seagull. That is also a white bird, rapid, soaring, majestic, and which can alight with ease and poise itself upon the stormiest wave. So I could be wrong, or Mathew wrote it and Fuller modified it, but there's a red flag there. He would not have said that because he had so much respect for Abby's poetry that he would have classed her among those. So that's the end of that. We've hit an hour here, and I am going to modify my paper on Elizabeth Barrett, even though I've announced it to a few people. I did get one response, by the way, a professor, apparently a pretty distinguished one, and he wrote one sentence. He wrote me a one-sentence response, and that was, why have you not published or thought about publishing in scholarly journals? And that was it. That was the only thing he had to say. And I sent him a long reply, like 7 or 8 or 9 paragraph reply, and I haven't gotten anything back. So, as I said, these people will send me rhetorical questions, which they think there's no answer to, and then I will take the serious road, interpret it as a serious question, whether it was or not, and I will answer it in full, and then I never hear back. This happens over and over. Well, I think it's just too much to take in. As philosophy professor Robert Almeter said when I interviewed him, he said, with regard to Ian Stevenson's results in reincarnation research, he gave an analogy, and he said, if somebody comes to you and says, your brother is a murderer, your brother just killed somebody, your first response is going to be to throw it out, not to believe it. You can't believe that. It's too outrageous. And I think that's what's happening here. People just throw it out because it's too much. They can't believe it. And if they can believe that some of these people plagiarize certain works, they can't believe that they plagiarize their major works, the ones they're known for. And they can't believe that they really did it on such a scale and so brazenly. And they can't believe that somebody outside of academia had made this discovery, which is going to upend our understanding of 19th century literature altogether. And they can't believe that I've identified who I was in a past life and that I was actually the author of these things, or that Abby was actually the author. And they certainly can't believe that I'm in contact with Abby today in the spirit world, and that she's collaborating with me and helping me find these. Because when I share these smoking guns, they didn't all come from me. Abby threw these things in my path, some of them. I would never have found them without her intervention. And the way that works is exactly the same way, as near as I can tell, as people on the other side give their loved ones signs, feathers, pennies, certain numbers, songs, animals sticking close or congregating when they shouldn't normally do that. The favorite animals of the person who had died, Well, Abby uses these same techniques with permission, as near as I can tell, to throw some of these smoking guns in my path. So my papers are as strong as they are, partly because of that collaboration. But of course, that people certainly can't buy that. So like the announcement that one's brother is a murderer, it's all thrown out. And the only thing that this erudite professor can say, he's speechless. The only thing he can say in, I don't know whether it's derision or what, he says, why haven't you published in scholarly journals? It's an accusation, basically. If you were genuine, you would have published in a scholarly journal. Well, that's just not true, because the scholarly journal has the same reaction as everybody else. They throw it out. But meanwhile, I have spent months wasting my time tying up my paper with these people, and then months later, they kick it back without any reason or without any good reason, because they've done the same thing everybody else has done. There's no point in my submitting to scholarly journals. That being said, when I sent my paper about Charles Dickens around, and nobody but the people who are really interested is going to be hearing this at, past the hour mark. One of them wrote back and said, this is the submission process, or I don't know what they said, but they responded. And I wrote back and said, actually, I was just bringing it to your attention. I wasn't trying to submit it, because I was writing to the editor, but I was writing to the editor as a professor, see? And I said, besides, this has been published in Real Paranormal Magazine, but, it's earth-shaking work. This is really significant. And I didn't say it in these words, but basically, if you knew it was good for you, you would publish it anyway, even though it's already been published, Well, I didn't hear and I didn't hear. And then I got back something that they are going to consider it, and rest assured that we'll give it, due consideration. I believe this is a major, I won't name it, but this is a major journal, and I'm like, okay. And I, wasn't sure the same person was writing me back as I'd initially talked to. So I said, be aware that this was published already in Real Paranormal Magazine, but that I don't think that had a very wide subscription. I don't think very many people saw it, because they didn't try to promote it very well. And there's probably almost no crossover between the ghost hunters and people like that and the scholars who will be reading the scholarly journal. So probably it'll be fresh to everybody. I didn't reiterate the fact that I had sent notices to like 600 professors so that they've all had the opportunity to read it anyway. But it's possible that they will deign to publish it. I don't know, but it's conceivable that they will. So I'll keep you guys posted on that. I'm not holding my breath on that one, But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and edit this. It'll edit down to a little bit over an hour. I had to really go through the whole thing for obvious reasons, because this is Mathew Franklin Whittier writing in tribute to Abby about poetry that was plagiarized by Elizabeth Barrett. And the review has been sabotaged, but not effectively, by Margaret Fuller, because she was too lazy to rewrite the whole thing. All she could do is go in and insert things that expressed her gushing, unthinking praise for Elizabeth Barrett, without looking deeper to find Matthew's ambiguous phrases and code and so on. It would make absolutely no sense if it was written by the same person. And then I've also shown you that definitely Margaret Fuller did not write all of these, because she was not born in the winter. So there you have it. I still am waiting for my copy of the fake Ethan Spike from 1866. It's hung up in a little town in Pennsylvania. The post office tells me it's going to be late, which I already knew. It's like well over a week late. And when that comes in, we'll go through it together. I've only read like the introduction that was in the photograph for eBay. And then again, if I find out something else that I really need to talk about here, I will bring that up as well. In the meantime, I'm going to spend the day editing this, and if I have time, get in and add yesterday's information into my paper.